Hello and welcome to UK Column Live. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish, and I've got with me in the studio Wilfred Wong. Hello.
Hello.
And Wilfred is a very experienced child protection campaigner, some 22 years experience. He was originally trained as a barrister, but his particular expertise is satanic ritual abuse. Now, we're going to spend 45 minutes on this subject. It is dark, it is heavy. We feel that the time is right that not only the UK column needs to start talking about this particular aspect of child abuse, but we're hoping that if we take the lead on this subject, we are going to get other news and media outlets to start to investigate this subject for themselves. Now, before we get going with Wilfred, I'm just going to put up a warning on the screen. We think it's right to do this. The topic of today's UK Column Live is satanic ritual abuse. We don't think this interview is suitable for children, maybe even some young people. And we're going to cover topics with some images which some people can find disturbing. And underneath we've got a little paragraph setting out some of the broad characteristics of satanic ritual abuse, SRA. Now, Wilfred, you came up with that little paragraph. We're dealing with some pretty heavy stuff here.
Yes, we are. It's the most destructive and sadistic form of child abuse in this country.
Right. Well, many people, we feel, would be saying, well, this can't be true. Satanic ritual abuse can't exist. And we thought, what can we do to start off by showing people that, well, actually, something is going on in this country and what we are talking about is real. And perhaps it's appropriate to bring up this image of a BBC report from a few years ago where it states quite boldly that the Royal Navy in Britain has approved its first ever Satanist. The British Armed Forces have officially recognised its first registered Satanist, and that Satanist is going to be allowed to practice his dark arts on board a warship. Now, in the article, it also goes on to say that his particular objective was to get this a formally registered religion within the British Armed Forces. For myself, as a former serving Royal Navy officer with having had command of a small warship at one stage, I find this an extraordinary state of affairs that the British government is condoning and encouraging Satanism. But there we have it. The British government thinks that Satanism's acceptable. Would you have a comment for the government?
Well, the irony is that while they accept that Satanism exists and they even want it officially recognized in the armed forces, they still have yet to officially recognize that Satanist ritual abuse exists. Right. Now, I would point out that not all Satanists necessarily are involved in SRA, but many are. And it's time for the government to come clean and acknowledge that SRA exists and deal with it in a much more effective way than they have so far.
Yeah. Well, I can say I find it very interesting that subsequent to the government introducing Satanism on board British warships, that I am hearing that there have been some particularly unpleasant cases of bullying. I know of one case when a sailor returned to his bunk to find a carving knife rammed through his bedding and the mattress. I'm hearing reports of some very unpleasant bullying occurring. Now, did bullying take place 20, 25 years ago? Of course it did. But to my mind, there's something darker happening. Whether the two are related, we can't prove in this programme, but I think it's appropriate to say publicly something seems to be happening. Now, we picked up on the fact that child abuse is coming to the surface in UK. We've got Theresa May, who's convened the recent child abuse inquiry. And in this article from The Guardian, we get 2 points. There's hope that child abuse is being exposed, but in the article the journalist goes on to say, isn't it interesting that the fact that they put a start point of 1970 means that nothing that was done when the Home Office was in control of the children's home will come to the surface. So Nick Cohen in this article is really saying, well, Theresa May, you've called the inquiry, but your own department office, the Home Office, is not likely to come under scrutiny. Just with a brief comment, Wilfred, what's your feeling over Theresa May's child abuse inquiry?
Well, in my activities as a child protection campaigner, I've observed many times that the majority, more than 50% of uninvestigated child abuse cases in the UK, which ought to be investigated, are related to Satanist ritual abuse.
Right.
And my major concern is that Theresa May and the government in general are not publicly acknowledging SRA or publicly talking about the need to deal with SRA as part of all these inquiries. No doubt many SRA survivors will be referring their cases to these inquiries, but it remains to be seen whether the government will publicly acknowledge this SRA element in these cases, or as often happens, simply censor it out when they talk about such cases.
Right. So you're saying 50% of the cases. Now you've got
more than 50%.
More. So you've got a lot of experience over 22 years. You're saying more than 50% of the cases have got an SRA component. The government not picking up on that. Why do you think that is?
Unfortunately, because SRA goes all the way up to the establishment. And there are members of the establishment or some members in Parliament who are also involved in SRA. And we know that people involved in SRA also have influence in certain police forces over certain government bodies.
Yeah.
They seek power. They seek power and influence. They also seek to transform society. They're nothing like the people who engage in what we might regard as ordinary child abuse. Not to say it's not horrific, ordinary child abuse, it is, but the ordinary child abusers do not seek the kind of power and influence which people engaged in SRA do. And so this is able to distort government action and views on SRA. The media are also part of the problem because they're not identifying SRA as they should and pressuring the government to deal with this issue.
Right.
They're generally very quiet. They themselves exercise censorship on this issue, with the very notable and positive exception of papers like the Sunday Express and the Sunday People. So with all this kind of cover-ups going on and indifference that we see on SRA, it's been very difficult to get it as publicly exposed as it should be.
Right.
But the key to dealing with SRA is to publicly expose it, because once we do that, then the British government feels much more pressure to deal with the issue and to publicly acknowledge it.
Interesting point, goes right to the top of the tree. So people within the political system, people within the establishment, you're saying, are involved. And perhaps it's just reasonable to say at this point that as we look at more and more things are coming out in the public media about the quality of our politicians, we see them involved in fraud, they're deceiving the public, they're taking drugs, they're involved with prostitutes and rent boys. We don't have to go too far in this direction to say, well, the abuse of children comes in at the higher levels of the political circles and the establishment, and now we're saying, well, actually some of them are a step above that because they've got their own religious doctrine going with it, the satanic element. Yeah. So we also thought we'd just highlight on the case, of course, of the Goddard inquiry. So we've finally got somebody supposedly in charge of an independent inquiry. We did a little bit of work over the last few days about what was happening around Ms. Goddard. If we can just bring that on screen, there we are. What we found interesting was, although we're told this is an independent inquiry, Justice Goddard is surrounded by staff who are actually still in the employment of the Home Secretary. And then who takes all of the calls? It isn't an independent call centre, it's an NSPCC call centre. And we've got a picture of Melanie Shaw there. Now, Melanie has gone through horrific abuse, sexual abuse, not only in her family life from a very small age, but later on in Beechwood Children's Home, Nottingham. There is a component of her abuse, a substantial component, relating to SRA. At the moment, Justice Goddard doesn't want to seem to know Melanie Shaw. Just any comments about how you see Miss Goddard and her inquiry? Do you think she's going to do a job?
I think one major indicator of whether she's going to do her job will be whether she talks about SRA, whether she publicly acknowledges the extent of SRA cases that are bound to be referred to her, and whether she actually forces the police to investigate these SRA cases. And if she doesn't do these things, then it's more likely that all these inquiries are simply cosmetic in order to basically keep things generally as they are, business as usual.
Under wraps.
Under wraps.
And that's probably a perfect introduction to bring in this man, Geoffrey Dickens, who I know that you've got a lot of respect for. You've said to me earlier on that this is a man who really has tried to get the truth out about not only abuse of children, but the SRA aspect. What can you tell us about Mr. Dickens and his work?
Geoffrey Dickens was the first MP to speak out about SRA very boldly and very publicly, even within the chamber of the House of Commons. And he was the only British MP so far who has ever done so much to try and expose SRA. Unfortunately, he died relatively young in the mid-90s from heart problems.
Yeah.
And although he has passed on, he did leave us a legacy. And today, for example, we see in the media reports about the dossier, which he passed on to the then Home Secretary, Leon Britton, containing the names of various VIP child abusers. And I have no doubt whatsoever that those names include names of VIPs involved in SRA, because Geoffrey Dickens was very much involved in exposing SRA. He's bound to have had that information and had it in the dossier. And that's another reason why the authorities have worked so hard to suppress that dossier, because the authorities often do more to cover up SRA than to help expose it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things which was pointed out in this particular article was that his home was his office and his home was broken into at least twice when he was attempting to expose what was going on. Was that coincidental? We don't know, but we just thought we'd flag it up. It does seem to be an amazing coincidence. Were people after the evidence that he held? Were they trying to remove it? But also reported here with the TAP blog, encourage people to go and see this particular blog, very informative. They've got a very good article here. Geoffrey Dickens reported that children were being satanically abused and murdered in the 1980s. And there's a very powerful video clip by this lady, Diane Corr. And I believe you know Diane.
Yes, I have a lot of respect for Diane. Diane Corr was one of the earliest campaigners on SRA in this country, and she spoke out very boldly. Unfortunately, as often happens with such people, she received a lot of death threats, and a charity shop she ran was even firebombed by the Satanists.
Right.
But it shows you the extent that people go to try and suppress any publicity about SRA. If there's nothing to SRA, as the skeptics claim, why do people go to such lengths to suppress all public exposure of SRA, including the use of violence and death threats?
Well, on that subject, we'll probably bring this man in straight away, because we've got the MP, Mr. Danzuk, and of course he specifically said that the night before his appearance at the committee concerning the Geoffrey Dickens dossier, he had an encounter with the Honourable Learned Member for Harborough, Sir Edward Garnier, who, well, in his own words, said after the, Mr. Danzuk said after the 10 p.m. vote, he drew me to one side outside the chamber and warned me to think very carefully about what I was going to say the following day. What an incredible statement. We've labelled this challenging Lord Britain on child abuse would not be a wise move. Now, was that a threat? Was it a veiled threat? I would regard it as a threat, but the minimum is a veiled threat. That seems to agree with your statement that they desire to keep this stuff under wraps.
Yes, the great lengths they will go to, including the use of threats and sometimes the use of violence, shows you that this is not just about a disagreement over the existence of SRA. This is about a full-blown attempt to suppress any publicity exposing SRA.
And what it's about. Well, let's come on to a particularly serious and dark subject, and that's, of course, Jimmy Savile. And the advantage, if I can put it that way, of Jimmy Savile, of course, is that a lot of material's now been revealed and a lot's been published about him. If I just bring up a couple of these on screen, we've got the Express here stating very clearly Jimmy Savile was part of a satanic ring. The perverted star wore a hooded robe and mask as he abused a terrified victim in a candlelit basement. There's a lot of detail in this particular article. We've got more from the Express here. Charities claim that satanic abuse of children is rife. And within that report, it said this. So this is a November 2014 report. One campaigner said that he'd heard of babies being born but never registered. And some of these babies are being killed. So this is pretty powerful stuff.
It's a common characteristic of SRA to have babies born and not register them and then use them for sacrifice, ritual sacrifice. So it is part of their belief system, and it commonly comes up in SRA cases. We're talking about sexual abuse, but we're also talking about murder.
Right. Now, I'm going to say that a few years ago, I had a call from a gentleman from Cumbria, and we were talking about just matters spiritual, biblically based. But towards the end of the conversation, he said to me very casually, he said, "Brian, you've been talking about the abuse of children. Are you aware about the satanic aspect?" And at that time, I said to him, "Absolutely not. I haven't encountered that." And he then talked about a lady working with a charity, at the time, middle-aged lady working with a little group of other ladies of a similar age. And he said what they were doing was trying to rescue the girls who were actually having the babies, breeding the babies for use by these cults. And sometime later, I was able to have, I think it was about a 3.5-hour conversation with this particular lady, where she told me what at that time was just incredible. It was incredible to hear. I believed what she was saying to me, but I had never come into contact with this sort of thing before. But that lady was saying from first-hand experience, yes, girls, and very young girls, were being used to breed children.
Yes, they are often referred to as broodmares, and I've met some of these girls myself, and they are used to give birth to these unregistered babies, who are then used for sacrifice. But another method that the Satanists may use is to forcibly abort one of these broodmares and then use the aborted child as a sacrifice to the devil. And so these are commonly practiced by the Satanists who are engaged in SRA. It's been going on for years. It's not a recent phenomenon. It's been going on for at least decades. And yet, so little has been done to try and stop this.
Yeah. And clearly, with this going on, it needs to be stopped. Now, a major case that had a very substantial satanic ritual abuse element to it is, in fact, the Holly Gregg case. And, of course, in trying to get justice for Holly Gregg, Robert Greene ends up imprisoning twice. But this is an important aspect. This case, choosing my words very carefully, it's not just ordinary child abuse, to use that description, which is not a very kind description, but we're trying to differentiate here between abuse of children in a sexual sense, as opposed to this satanic ritual abuse. Significant element in this case of SRA.
Yes, definitely. In fact, Robert Greene and I had a long interview with Anne Gregg, the mother of Holly, and Holly Gregg present, and the SRA in the case was described, including the ritual sacrifice of adult male, which Holly was then forced to eat part of the sacrifice. And this is common in SRA, that the people present at the meeting will eat part of the sacrificial victim. And another time when Holly witnessed the sacrifice of a dog, another ritual sacrifice where afterwards she was forced to drink the blood of the dog. We're not talking about ordinary child abuse here. We're talking about Satanist ritual abuse. And if you want to look at the roots of why it's been so hard to get the police to investigate the Holly case, why there's been so many attempts to cover it up, going up to high levels of politics in Scotland, you only need to look at the Satanism and the SRA. Same with the Jimmy Savile case, why he was able to get away with his crimes for so many years. You don't have to look very far. Look at the Satanism and the SRA, and that will help to explain a lot. Because SRA and cover-up, more often than not, go hand in hand together.
Right. Well, you've mentioned Jimmy Savile. Just come back to one. On the basis, is this going on in Scotland and charities warning about it? Well, we've just brought up one charity that's doing some very good work, which is Izzy's Promise. This is a charity dedicated to helping people who've been abused in a ritualistic way. And we've had some very good reports about this charity. I'm just using this as one example to reinforce the fact that there's not one or two cases going on. There's so many cases that you actually need a volunteer charity to come forward to try and help people. This is real, it's happening, and it's happening in a significant number of cases.
Yes, I would estimate that over the last couple of decades, we're talking about at least thousands of people who have been subjected to SRA, and thousands of SRA survivors coming out. And this is one part of the big evidence about SRA, is that there is a constant flow of SRA survivors coming out, all talking about very common characteristics of SRA in their testimonies.
Right.
And this flow isn't going to stop. No matter how much the government or the police stick their heads in the ground, the flow of SRA survivors keeps coming.
Yeah.
And that's because SRA is happening, and it's growing because the police won't deal with it effectively. Well, most of the police won't.
Right. Well, we could also, we haven't got time in this particular interview, but we're going to do more. But we could also talk about the wider political agenda that we would say is actually supporting this satanic agenda. Mm-hmm. And as we've seen from the Royal Navy, it's being brought in as political policy. It's not in our imaginations. The governments are bringing it in. Let's just have a look at Jimmy Savile again here. We're sticking with the Express headlines. There were reports in other papers, but the Express dealt with this in a particularly clear way. So the headline here, I was raped at 13 by Jimmy Savile in a Satanist ritual. A victim talking out about her sheer terror as she was tied to an altar and raped by the depraved star, she says, during a black mass. And we've got this one here, which is talking about Savile going to a weird place known locally as the Chamber, which had a ceremonial whipping post in the centre of the room, and the room was decorated with an occult-style pentagram, goats' heads. Now, the building exists, but it would appear that since the Savile exposure, that it's been completely renovated and redecorated, and all of this paraphernalia has been removed. Can you tell us anything more about these particular reports on Savile?
Well, I know that there are other SRA survivors of Savile's out there, apart from the one who was interviewed by the Sunday Express. I attended a talk a few years ago by a carer for one of Savile's SRA survivors who was not well enough to come and speak himself. And the carrier described the trauma which the SRA survivor still suffers from years after he was abused by Jimmy Savile. I also know that there were, even apart from that person, there were other SRA survivors as well who went to various therapists for help, and the therapists have mentioned this, that they knew about Savile long before he was exposed because of what the SRA survivors were saying.
Right.
And so it's been known for a long time that Savile was involved in SRA. It's been known for an even longer time that he was involved in some form of child abuse because the reports were going on for years. The trouble is we don't seem to have learned anything because, as with SRA, for years there have been many reports about this, but people just close their eyes, close their ears. They don't want to listen. And one day, it will all come out, and then people, as in the Savile case, will be saying, oh, why didn't we do something sooner? We should have taken these reports more seriously. Yeah. But by then, it'll be too late for all those victims who've been victimized by SRA. So the thing to do is to learn from the Savile case, I believe, and to take seriously what the victims say. Listen to the victims. It's not that long ago where with ordinary child abuse, even with that, victims weren't listened to. Yeah. There was the skepticism. And it's the skepticism that often protects the abusers.
Yes.
And I'm not saying we simply take everything they say as 100% truth, but we should be open-minded enough to investigate. And this is the problem with the police. They often do not thoroughly investigate these allegations of SRA. The Holly Gregg case is an example. Yeah. Holly named at least 22 suspects to the police. They only ever interviewed at most 2 of them, and they didn't even bother to check their computers for pornography, child pornography. So with this kind of half-hearted attitude, it's no wonder that the police then come back and say, oh, we haven't found enough evidence to justify a prosecution, because they're not even trying hard to look for the evidence.
Yeah. Well, you've set out for us, and we're just going to run through some of the characteristics. We're talking about SRA. What are we really talking about? Now, this list is not exhausted, but essentially we call up some of the things on screens. I'm going to do this quite quickly because Wilfred is then going to talk about it. But these are some of the characteristics which you say come up in SRA. So this is quite a simple thing, but people are dressed in a particular way, robes and hoods, and a number of victims report this, hooded figures being in the room with them. We've got children being drugged prior to being abused, and I have certainly been told about this in one case in particular with a mother and her daughter, where the daughter said, every time I go to see a particular family member, I can't remember things and I have headaches and I feel strange. Children being forced to ingest human or animal feces and urine. This is disgusting stuff. This is part of the subject, so no apologies to our audience. Children being forced to drink human or animal blood. And I'll bring these up. Children in cages, children placed in coffins and buried, children forced to sexually abuse other children, ritual sacrifice, which you've already mentioned, humans and animals, and children being forced to watch the human and animal sacrifice, but also eat parts, which you've just talked to us about. Children being forced to participate in the killing of the sacrificial victim. Now, this is one of the points that was particularly made by the Hampstead children. We'll come on to them in a minute. And the last one we've got on this screen, women or girls being forcibly impregnated. Again, you've covered that. And then this one, which I think is so telling, death threats against the children, their loved ones, and even their pets if the child victims reveal the abuse which they've suffered. This is pretty nasty stuff, isn't it?
Yes, and it's also designed to corrupt the children, that these ritual abusers are not content to abuse the children. They want to corrupt them and turn them into abusers themselves. So, for example, they force the children to abuse other children, which is one of the characteristics. And also they force the children to take part in some of the killings, ritual sacrifices that take place. And so it's a very comprehensive program, you could say, to corrupt the child and also to subject the child to emotional, mental, and physical torture for a very long period. So what these SRA survivors go through, basically it's hell. They go through prolonged mental, physical torture. They go through this series of practices which are designed to corrupt them and turn them into abusers themselves.
Yeah.
And they go through being victimized repeatedly by the ritual abusers. So it's no wonder that many of them, at the end of all this, are very damaged and need a lot of help. But when the skeptics come out and say, oh no, SRA doesn't exist, what they're doing is actually secondary abuse. On top of all that they've suffered, then they have these skeptics coming out saying, oh no, what you're saying is just imaginary or lies, doesn't exist. How do you think they feel at the end of all that when they finally have the courage to speak out about what they've suffered?
Yeah.
And then they're being poo-pooed by some journalists or other people in the media. So this, we need to try and stand in their shoes, as hard as it may be, how awful it is for them.
I'm nodding because I have to say we've experienced this ourselves. We've spent considerable time with some of the victims of child abuse, and we have come into contact with SRA victims, and it's deeply hurting when people start attacking the victims again. You're not telling the truth, you're doing this. It's really quite offensive. But that's life, and it's one of the things we've got to get over in talking about the subject. Is it real? Well, we thought we'd just bring up for you on screen some of the cases that have actually gone to court. People have been sentenced. You can freeze this screen while you're watching this interview to have a look in more detail. But we wanted to put some evidence on screen. So we've got 4 adults convicted in 1982 in Telford for a series of serious offences against children, but it also included SRA. 23rd of July 1987, man convicted at Central Criminal Court, London. 15 girls and boys, but he was assaulting them in front of an altar to Satan. August 1990, Reginald Harris convicted. We'll bring on the next page. Here we are, 1992, 57-year-old Satanist sentenced Liverpool Crown Court, sexually abusing his niece. Pretty unpleasant stuff. 2011, Colin Batley, leader of a Satanist coven, Swansea Crown Court. There was a whole family involved in that case. And finally, we've got a case in Cornwall, and we just bring that one up on screen as it was reported in the Independent, because one of the things is the judge says in this case not only how horrific the abuse was, but that the damage, the immense damage on the victims. But we're not making this up. These are the cases going through courts actually talking about satanic abuse.
Well, they were successfully prosecuted. The ritual abusers were convicted and sent off to prison. I would emphasize 2 things, though. For every one case that is successfully prosecuted in the UK, there are dozens, if not more than dozens, of other cases of SRA which remain uninvestigated. Secondly, I would emphasize that these cases, which are strong evidence of SRA, especially given the high standards of evidence required in the British courts to get a conviction, are completely ignored by the people who keep on claiming that there is no evidence for SRA. They don't even mention these cases. They pretend as if they don't exist. Yeah. The fact is they do exist. They are evidence, and unfortunately, there needs to be more cases than these, because the vast majority of SRA cases out there don't get investigated. They don't even get on the line, get past the starting point of going towards a successful conviction.
Yeah. Do you think that the subject itself, which is deeply unpleasant, very dark, distasteful to a lot of people, we know that some people simply cannot cope with this subject. They won't be watching this interview, they can't cope with it. Other people can cope with it. But do you believe that some journalists are not reporting this because they also just can't deal with the subject? Or do you think they are being turned off by the editorial boards?
Well, let me just say that we know that with some journalists, not all, there is a particular vested interest that they have in suppressing any information about SRA.
Right.
Because we know for a fact that the Satanists who have engaged in SRA have infiltrated many different levels of society, including the media. Not surprising, since the media has such a key role to play on public information or disinformation, in the case of SRA. So I can't really go into more detail on that, but we need to bear in mind that some of these journalists have a strong vested interest to cover up SRA. I would also point out that the media has a key role in exposing it. And the media has no excuse to say that they're squeamish about it, because they report on a whole range of dark issues. Yeah. In fact, most of the bad news gets into the media. They don't report on good news normally. And they're not acting responsibly, unfortunately, when it comes to SRA, with the notable exceptions of a few papers.
Right.
And so we need to sometimes challenge the media to speak out more about this. What are they going to do about it? I've seen the media report on some cases in depth, which I knew involved SRA, and they censored all the mention of SRA out of the case and simply presented it as ordinary child abuse.
Right.
That sometimes happens, and it's very disappointing that they would do that. It's a very deliberate censorship that often occurs.
Okay, well, we know that some of the cases do get into the press and media. I've just picked up on this one from the South Wales Evening Post, because this is to do with this family involved in the satanic ritual abuse in South Wales, and this is the daughter who's written a book about her experiences. I haven't read that book, but I believe it would be an extremely interesting book to read. We've got Angifan here. I hope I pronounced that properly. But talking about SRA, not in this country, but in Australia. This is not a phenomenon just for one country in the world. It follows a pattern in other countries. And even Russia Today picking up on the fact that a particular bishop had been naming the late Tory Enoch Powell with regard to child sex abuse with a satanic background. Now, I don't know anything about that particular case. We're simply putting up these reports to say that people are talking about it. But of course, a major case that hit the headlines fairly recently was the Hampstead satanic abuse case, with these two young children coming forward and saying to camera what they'd experienced. What has happened? Let's just have a look at how this thing has gone, because those children told their story. Here's the headline from the Telegraph. The mother, who actually went to social services saying, my children have been abused within a satanic environment. She wanted help from social services. Here's the Telegraph's headline. Evil mother tortured her own children into telling police their father was the leader of a satanic cult. And then if we follow that through, really, the BBC then said, well, let's interview the father. So the man who the children accused, very, very clearly in a video where they were describing all sorts of things they couldn't possibly have known about of young children, the BBC says, we'll have that man on and interview him. Well, they didn't tell the audience, of course, he's an actor. Now, the case has happened, and according to the case, this gentleman is not guilty of any crime, but the mother is apparently guilty of... Is this the way that the media and the state deal with these cases? It's almost like it's been twisted 180 degrees from the truth.
Yes, it's basically a spin that's been put on this. Unfortunately, she's not the first mother to try and expose SRA against her children, who's ended up losing her children as a result.
Yeah.
There are many mothers in this country who have tried to expose SRA against their children, and then were accused of making it up, accused of being not good for their children's welfare, and having their children taken away.
Yes.
It's a recurring pattern. It's a kind of like a tactic used to suppress SRA from being exposed and to protect people engaged in SRA. I do not know whether the husband of this lady was involved in SRA or not, but at the very least, the police should not have prejudged her, and the media should not have prejudged her, and they should have thoroughly investigated the children's allegations, which they didn't do.
As was the case with Holly Gregg, of course. We've got a pattern.
Exactly.
We've always got a pattern of no investigation equals no crime.
Yeah, no thorough investigation. Because of the sheer gravity of the allegations, the very least the police should do is thoroughly investigate the allegations, not prejudge them, not say, oh, you know, I just can't believe such things happen, so I'm not going to investigate it thoroughly. And neither should the media try and prejudge it and say, oh, it can't possibly be true. At the end of the day, only a thorough investigation will help to bring light to the situation. And it's the police's job to do it. And in most cases, they don't even do it. We're not asking the police to go the extra 100 miles. We're just asking them to do their job.
To do their job, and of course, failure to investigate a crime is a criminal act in itself. So in not investigating what has been reported as a crime, that's a criminal act by the police. Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, with Hampstead, we know that certain police officers did take the right action, and reports were made to the Metropolitan Police's Satanic Ritual Abuse Unit. And what did that produce? Well, it produced no help for the family, but it did produce threats and intimidation amongst Metropolitan Police officers. And we know this because we were with officers who were aware of what was going on. And they said basically police officers were being threatened very clearly, how do we put this, to get your snout out of the Hampstead case. So for me, this case was very real. What the children said as very young children was very credible. I personally met the mother. I believe what that lady had to say. I met her partner. I think the correct description is a bit of a rough diamond. Do I believe what he said? Absolutely. And yet it's been twisted round. Mother, evil torturer of her children, and her partner, who helped stand up to say what is going on here. Both of these two vilified in the press. I think the Hampstead case very significant because of its connections into high level of the political system. That's what I've been told.
Yes, well, it has so many common traits in SRA cases, including the police being told to stand down on the case, which is also very common. Yeah. And we suspect may have been the case with the Holly Gregg case as well. There are some honest, sincere police, thankfully, who do try to work on these cases and do their job, but in many cases, they are told by other officers, often higher-ranking officers, to stand down.
Stand down, yeah.
So it is a problem. I remember reading a news report not long ago that 40 police officers wanted to speak out about child abuse cover-ups that they had experienced in the course of their careers, but were being prevented from doing so. So there's a lot of this going on, and we need to basically expose it for the sake of the children.
And we need to back up the police who are trying to do the right things.
Yes, definitely.
Many of them very brave men and women. They're trying to speak out in quite dangerous circumstances in some cases.
Yes.
But if physical threats are one way of closing down, of course, this is the other, because this is a common tactic. Satanic child abuse claims are almost certainly based on false memories. So in come the psychiatrists, psychologists. Oh, this is all nonsense. It's all based on pretty extreme Christians is often part of the attack, and it's false memory syndrome. What would you say to a paper like The Guardian that says, well, actually, the Hampstead children were on camera. They described parts of people's bodies in great detail that they couldn't possibly have known. They talk about sexual practices and other practices they couldn't read in a book. What do you say when the Guardian says, well, this is all sort of false memory syndrome?
Well, there are a number of things to say. Many children on both sides of the Atlantic, in the UK and in America, and in parts of Europe as well, have described what the Hampstead SRA case children said. Same kind of characteristics, same kind of abuse.
Yeah.
They are not making it up, because how can they? How can they all be colluding with each other across the Atlantic to make up these stories? Where are they getting it from? Where are they getting all these very unusual and very horrific details from? Some people will try and suggest horror videos, but there are very few, if any, horror videos that actually go into detail on SRA issues. So it's something that's even harder to believe, that all these children are just making it up, because these are not the only children who have said such things. There are many children over the years who've been saying these things. Another thing I would point out is that there's no hard scientific evidence to back up the claim about false memories. It's just another spin on things to suppress SRA being publicized. And if you meet, as you have, SRA survivors in person, and you see their real trauma when they talk about these issues, their real trauma on the anniversary of certain dates in the Satanist calendar, you can see that they're not making it up. It's for real. Nothing false or mistaken memories can cause such deep trauma in a person. Yeah. So it's just another kind of propaganda move to sweep SRA under the carpet. But things are changing with the Jimmy Savile case and the revelations about the VIP abuse. There are opportunities which are unprecedented to expose SRA.
Right.
But we need to speak out. We need to keep speaking out about SRA publicly. We need to pressure our MPs, the government on this subject. It's what we do now to use these opportunities that will make a big difference. You know, they said that Winston Churchill won the war by talking about it. He mobilized the 26 letters of the alphabet to go to war. We need to do the same on SRA. We're not going to win it by not talking about it. And if we don't talk about it, the skeptics are going to dominate all the discussion on SRA.
Right, that's a powerful speech, Wilfred, on what we should be doing. And of course, I'm going to add, we need our church leaders to stand up on this subject, because at the moment we see almost no comment from the churches on what they should be there to fight. Maybe we'll do a bit more detail on the spiritual side of it in another interview. Just to finish on the subject, and more proof that something particularly unpleasant is going on. Of course, the evidence is all there of very unpleasant mutilation and killing of animals, which I'm sure animal lovers will find deeply offensive. This is an article from a Mail: rare sheep slaughtered and dragged around to make a spiral of blood as a satanic ritual on summer solstice. We've also got this one here where goats were being slaughtered and mutilated at a farm. There are a lot of these reports, in fact many more than we would actually find on cases involving human beings. Quite interesting, isn't it? The press will report on mutilations and killings of animals. They're a lot more reticent in talking about children. The evidence I'm going to suggest to our audience is in front of us that something extremely nasty is going on. You've said that we've got to get to grips with it in order to get the subject out to the general public. What do we say to members of the public who say, I'm believing what you're saying, but this is just too horrible, I can't get involved? How do we get people who should be standing up for the children, should be standing up for the animals, how do we get them to do things as opposed to shy away from this very dark subject?
Well, first I would say, if you think it's horrible and dark, imagine what the child who's being subjected to it on a regular basis thinks. If you think it's bad for you as an adult in safety, what is it like for the child victim who has no power, no control, and when he or she eventually grows up and tries to get justice, will be disbelieved. Put yourself in their shoes, hard as it is,
Right.
and imagine what it's like for them, for their sake, but also for the sake of your children, if you have children, or your grandchildren. Speak out, because the Satanist ritual abusers are always looking for more children to access. It could be your children one day, or your grandchildren.
Yeah.
For the sake of all the children in our society, including your own relations, you need to speak out now, and you need to try and stop these predators who are targeting children and animals. I know there are a lot of animal lovers in this country. Well, this is an issue of animal rights as well as children's rights, and also the rights of those who are learning disabled, vulnerable adults, because they're also preyed on by the ritual abusers.
Yes.
And we need to think of all these people, think of our future. If we don't protect the children, we're jeopardizing our own future, because the society's future is in the children. And that's one of the reasons why the Satanists target the children, because they want to hijack our society's future and put it in the hands of the Satanists. And we need to be aware of that. It's all going to come back to us sooner or later if we ignore it. And just to point out also, this point that has been claimed about Christians, I would stress that Christians are not doing very much on this issue, let alone creating it. They're certainly not creating any so-called myth about SRA. Most of the Christians I've dealt with regarding SRA are indifferent, I'm sad to say, or as skeptical as the non-Christians. In fact, some of the best allies I've had in exposing SRA are not Christians. So it's not, we mustn't take these stereotypes or these bigoted caricatures that some people would try and have us believe at face value. We need to look deeper. We need to look at the cases, the successfully prosecuted SRA cases, the evidence that is there, if we choose to look at it, that SRA is a big problem in this country.
And we need to deal with it. Wilfred, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us. I think that was a particularly powerful first look at what SRA is really about. I hope that you're going to be joining us again to follow through on this subject, to stay on the case and get some more detail in. For those of you who have watched the programme, thank you very much for doing so. Just a little bit of advice, and that is, if you go researching SRA and this type of subject, don't do it late into the night. Do a little bit and have a break and do something pleasant just to take the heat off. If this is not your subject, don't force yourself. But if you do think you can deal with it and you can start to help get the word out, then we need as much help as possible to talk about SRA. Thanks very much, Wilfred.
Thank you.
Goodbye.